So I'm privileged today to talk to you about some of the most important findings I think that social scientists have ever produced. And I would like to take claim for these findings, but I can't. Unfortunately, they were generated by Englishmen, which is, of course, kind of annoying. The slides I'm going to show you are from a book called The Spirit Level, and The Spirit Level is a study of the relationship between economics and health. And it's dead relevant to the question of what the state is for. So the first thing I'd like to point out, and I suppose you know this, is that the human condition is characterized by inherent inequality. I mean, we have a notion that people are inherently valuable, and that's a metaphysical notion in a sense, and I suppose our legal system and our moral systems are predicated on that idea, and it's a good thing. But if you move out of the domain of metaphysics, you find out very rapidly that people are characterized by tremendous differences in innate ability, and in luck, for that matter. For example, it's very lucky to be born in Canada, and most of you really don't have to bear any responsibility for that, right? It was just something that happened to you. So part of your privilege is merely a consequence of a kind of monstrous lottery. So one of the consequences of inherent inequality is that there is a tremendous disparity in distribution of resources. And this disparity characterizes every society that's ever been founded. Pareto, who discovered this inequality law, basically pointed out that 20% of the people always control 80% of the resources. And in fact, it's somewhat worse than that. And because of that, when you're thinking about economic issues, you have to think about economics in two ways. You have to think about absolute poverty and its potential effect on people. But it also turns out that you have to account for relative poverty. Now, you know, you might be all familiar with the rule of thumb idea, for example, that poverty causes crime. It's actually the case that that's not true. What causes crime, especially murderous crime, is relative poverty, although there are levels of absolute poverty that also cause substantial deprivation. So let me show you the first slide. So this is a very interesting graph, and you can't really see the countries on it, but that's okay. On the left-hand side of the graph, you have life expectancy in years. Along the top, along the bottom, you have national income per person. And what you see, if you look at the very top by 80, on the left-hand side, Costa Rica, which has an average national income of about $10,000, has hit 80 years in life expectancy, whereas the Americans, which have an annual income per person of $40,000 a year, have also hit 80. And so what that indicates is that below $10,000 a year, things are going to be pretty rough for you. But above $10,000 a year, you will have almost already got everything that money can buy you. So that's pretty interesting. So then you can see, well, it's definitely useful to remove absolute poverty, but after you remove absolute poverty, there are other factors that start to determine how people's lives are progressing. Now let's talk a little bit about relative poverty. Well, approximately speaking, 20% of the population always has 80% of the wealth, and of course there are societies where that's those distributions are much more extreme. It's worse in some wealthy countries than in others. So the Americans, the Portuguese, and those who inhabit Singapore live in countries where there's tremendous disparity in wealth distribution, even though the average income is quite high. And it's better in some other countries. So the Scandinavian countries and Japan are outstanding for their ability to decrease inequality in their societies, economic inequality. It turns out that Canada is basically in the middle, but advancing quite rapidly towards the status of countries like the US, Portugal, and Singapore. And the problem with that is that there are real consequences, and the consequences are so massive that no one suspected them. So this is, on the left-hand side, what you see is an index that's made up of the following indicators, and they're important indicators. Life expectancy, math ability and literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, mental health, mental illness, including drug and alcohol addiction, and social mobility. And along the bottom, you have income inequality. That's an index that's made up of the ratio, the amount that the top 20% of the population owns compared to the bottom 20%. And what you see is there's an absolutely perfect relationship between inequality in rich countries and that cumulative index. And that is one of the most powerful relationships that's ever been discovered, not only in social science, but in any science at all. Now, the reason for this, it seems to be that people are very, very sensitive. Their nervous systems are very, very sensitive to status differential. And the reason for that is because your brain produces a neurochemical called serotonin, and serotonin stabilizes your negative emotion, and allows you to experience calm, positive emotion. And if you're low in status, your brain doesn't produce very much serotonin, and that destabilizes your nervous system and deprives you of hope. And the physiological consequences of that are that you produce a tremendous amount of a stress hormone called cortisol, and that does pretty much everything bad that you can think of to you. So it shuts off your immune system, it makes you more obese, it makes you more prone to cancer, it impairs your intelligence, it increases the probability that you're going to develop Alzheimer's, etc., etc. Now the reason that happens is because if you're low status, your brain assumes that the environment is dangerous, even if in absolute terms it isn't, and it prepares your body for emergency action, which is a high stress condition. So what we see here, Canada is right in the middle of this graph, is that even among rich countries, societies that are badly off-center in terms of the distribution of wealth do worse. And you might object, well, that's okay, these are all health measures. What about social mobility, for example, and innovation? It turns out that more unequal rich countries have less innovation and have much less social mobility. So there isn't even a trade-off for creativity. So what does this mean? Now, the authors of this book, Wilkinson and Pickett, have also demonstrated in the US that the very wealthy in the US are likely to die about 5 years earlier than the middle class in Scandinavia and Japan. And that's because the stress that's produced by living in an unequal society is so overwhelming that even people who are at the top of the dominance hierarchy are in trouble. And that's probably because they feel threatened, because as the inequality distribution increases, the entire society destabilizes and they become more and more fearful, forcing them, for example, to live in gated communities, which is something I wouldn't particularly recommend. So what we have here, well, it's a fortress, you know. As soon as you have to build fortresses to keep other people out, you have to wonder exactly what's happened to your society. You also have to start asking yourself if your measures of wealth are actually the right measures, because it turns out for human beings, because we're unbelievably social, that the safety and integrity of our societies are incredibly important to our mental functioning and our physiological functioning. And so if you calculate wealth without taking into account the stability and opportunity of the surrounding community, it means that your measures of wealth are wrong. So what's the state for? Well, here's a couple of ideas, and I think they're ideas that could appeal to conservatives and socialists alike. Obviously, it's very useful for the social community to eradicate absolute poverty insofar as that's possible, because absolute poverty destroys people. And it also damages the community as a whole, because people who are absolutely poor cannot contribute in any meaningful way to the development of the community, because they're in a state of constant deprivation. But the state also has to mitigate the consequences of relative poverty. And basically what that means is that the state's purpose is to ensure justice in a manner that ensures stability, and that's to minimize the effect of negative emotions, and to provide hope. The state and all of its organs basically provides a story, and this is part of what we would be doing if we were trying to produce the rituals that would be behind a 150th anniversary celebration. We need to know, because we live inside stories, who we are, where we're going, how we're going to get there, and how we might transform ourselves along the way. And the function of stories is exactly to communicate that to people, and the fact that those things are so important is part of the reason why stories are so tremendously important to us, and why we learn as a consequence of listening to stories. So I suppose you could think to some degree that 150th celebration is a story. It's a story that defines where people are, where they're going, and how they're going to get there, as well as the transformations. The story essentially defines a fair game. Now, society is a large-scale game. And it's a game because the rules are somewhat arbitrary, but everybody's agreed on them. If the game is fair, everyone gets to play, and that means people aren't disenfranchised as a consequence of loss. Some will win, and that's okay, because there are certain kinds of games where winning is necessary to allow people to experience hope. But if the game is fair and proper, then those who don't win can still thrive, because that means they have the possibility of playing again. So that's the definition of the state. In 8 minutes. Thank you.